If there were not love between two hydrogen atoms and one oxygen atom, if there was not a desire for cooperation, a desire for union, then there would be no water. And so when you look out here in nature, everything that you can see in physical form is the result of a congregation of atoms or molecules who desire to congregate, to cooperate, to create whatever it is in front of our eyes that is beautiful to see. Everything has its place and everything contributes to the whole. So we come to this idea of water being this amazing substance which is created fundamentally out of love. It's created out of the love for oxygen, for hydrogen. It's created out of the love of mother substances, which are carbons and minerals and all those trace elements, all combine in water to produce this life elixir, which, if it is high quality, will endow us with extraordinary energy and longevity. So how do we get back to this water? What does this wonderful substance do for us? How can we treat it? How can we store it? Well, water, juvenile water, young water, is born in the forest. And as it gradually comes to the surface, it gathers to itself minerals, trace elements, until arriving at the surface as a spring, it is mature. It has its full complement of mother substances. It's ready to give. And one of the principal ingredients in good water is carbonic acid, which is a compound of hydrogen, carbon and oxygen. And when you put a glass of very good quality water out in the sun and you let it stand in the sun, then eventually you'll see some little bubbles form on the inside of the glass as the water heats up. And that is the conversion of carbonic acid into carbon dioxide. And all these little bubbles coming out represent the carbon dioxide coming out of the water, represent the body of the water, the good taste of the water coming out of it. And it also represents an enormous energy loss. And so many of our systems of reticulation today are designed merely from the point of view that water is a fluid, that it has no life, and so it doesn't matter which way you treat it. So we make it flow down straight channels, we make it flow into cylindrical objects, we make it flow into all sorts of vessels and shapes which are nowhere to be found in nature. And we don't perceive, even with so many spiral formations and spiral movements around us, I mean in terms of the spiral motion of the galaxies, in terms of the spiral movement of cyclones, tornadoes, and so on. All these spirals are there everywhere, and we don't see that nature has chosen these shapes because they represent those artifacts, those formations, which follow her laws of constant change. Because the only thing which is constant in nature is change. And if we want to create a system for water reticulation, then we must also create, within the forms that we provide, the possibility for water to change and transform and to renew itself. Viktor Schauberger, born in Austria in 1885, was descended from a long line of foresters and conservators of the forest, and in his blood he therefore had an enormous amount of information inherited, so to speak, genetically from his forebears. And the family motto was, "Have faith in the silent forests." He, as a young man, spent most of his time in the forest, and there he was able to perceive phenomena, energetic phenomena in nature, in untouched virgin forest, which gave him so many insights into the way nature functioned, and particularly with regard to water. He says that he used to sit beside a flowing stream and was never bored for a minute. He used to allow a part of his consciousness to flow away with the water. And when it was returned to him finally, the water psyche revealed many secrets to him. So in a sense he was able to send his consciousness to those places the eyes couldn't see. And in returning with information, it confirmed or further developed the theories that he had on water. Throughout his whole life, he was an unconventional person in terms of contemporary physics or science, and he had a long and running battle with scientists, often acrimonious, because those things that he said were the realities were usually in stark conflict with accepted theory at the time. And fundamentally this revolves around water and the way water should be viewed, and what is important for water to maintain its inner health and vitality. Now, what is water? Well, water, in Viktor Schauberger's view, is a living substance. And whether it has life or death depends on the way it's been treated, what it's handled, how it's forced to flow or how it flows, under what conditions it flows. And all these things Viktor Schauberger perceived in his long sojourn in the forest in Austria when he was a young forester. And he had access to phenomena, energetic phenomena, which nobody else had. And indeed, in 1930, he wrote a book called Our Senseless Toil, which laid out clearly for everyone to see all the environmental catastrophes that would happen and which would be inevitable if humanity did not change the way it dealt with water, treated water, and the forest as well, because the forest and water are so closely interconnected. You remove the forest, you remove the water at the same time. You destroy the forest, you destroy the water, because instead of flowing in coolness under the shade of trees, which is the way nature ordains for water to flow, it flows out in the sunlight and loses its energy. One of the great elements, the factors in water which Viktor was able to put his finger on, was that of temperature. When we are healthy, we say we haven't got a temperature. And water hasn't got a temperature when its temperature is 4 degrees Celsius. At this temperature, water is at its most dense, it has its highest energy content. It has its greatest life-giving potential at that temperature. And when the temperature increases above 4 degrees or below 4 degrees, then water gets less dense. And this anomaly point of water, and it's anomalous because all other liquids become consistently denser with cooling. Water is the only liquid which stops getting denser at 4 degrees and starts getting less dense below that. Oxygen is always present at all processes of growth and decay, and in water, which sphere it is active in depends on the water temperature. The critical temperature phase between one and the other is, according to Viktor Schauberger, about 9 degrees centigrade. Viktor saw a completely different view of phenomena, the water as a living substance, but the water itself was a transformer and receiver and emitter. It transformed the energies of the cosmos and the energies of the earth. And in this area, we also have to differentiate between the forces from the cosmos, which Viktor viewed as being male, and the forces of the earth, which were female. And water was what he called the first substance, the first born. And it was born through the interaction of the elements of the earth and the cosmos, and more particularly the sun. And it was the sun's fertilizing influence on water through oxygen, which in Viktor's view, was a lower form of solar radiation, which created the marvel that is water, made out of 2 hydrogen atoms and 1 oxygen atom in that combination. So, coming back to this operation of oxygen in water and how it functions in water, it is the inseminator in both cases of growth and decay. But when it's in a beneficial mode, then it is at a temperature below 9 degrees. The carbon substances, or the carbons of the earth, which Viktor grouped all together as under the name mother substances. These were every element except for oxygen and hydrogen. Hydrogen was the carrier substance, oxygen was male and fertilizing, and all the other substances were female. And if you think of the word material itself, it has its origins in the Latin word mater, which means mother. And so perhaps if we think of it in this way, then you get an idea of what mother substances mean. And when oxygen is bound or is fertilized under cool conditions, then the female part of the interaction surrounds the oxygen, which is passive. And then the energies are transferred in such a way, or transformed in such a way, as to provide creative, growing, beneficial things. And this is the interaction of oxygen and the mother substances below 9 degrees. Once the temperature goes above 9 degrees, then the oxygen becomes aggressive and it binds the mother substances, that it surrounds the mother substances, who then become passive. And in that situation, parasitic and bacterial life forms evolve. When we approach a new way of designing or a new way of looking at moving water, for instance, then we have to design a process which allows water to change and to transform and to move and to be itself, fundamentally to be itself. In the reticulation of water for drinking purposes, it's important to generate this longitudinal vortex. While the central flow is a simple spiral, the external peripheral flows is a double spiral movement, a rotation about the central spiral, which acts in a way like ball bearings and facilitates the faster flow of the central core water. This double spiral movement is inaugurated by the emplacement of guide vanes which deflect the water from an otherwise straight path into a spiral path. And these, in Viktor Schauberger's concept, would be silver-plated copper placed in a wooden pipe at certain intervals to create or provoke or promote this centripetal spiral flow. This spiral movement is the rejuvenating movement which endows water with fresh energy, and also because of the movement and because of the way the oxygen is separated from the core water initially and diverted to the outside, certain bacteria, pathogenic bacteria, anaerobic bacteria, are exposed to excess oxygen and die off. And in the process, the longer the movement down such a pipe, the purer and the more bacteria-free the water becomes. Water has certain patterns of motion. It has certain energies, and these energies are derived from its motion. And unless it is able to move in the way that generates its energies, then it becomes sluggish and slack. It's very important for water to be able to generate a longitudinal vortex in its flow, which enables it not only to reoxygenate itself, but also to cool itself. The oxygen is passive and it's not aggressive towards the water itself. Because of this movement, the water is cool, and after it has disposed of all the pathogens by over-oxygenating them, then it returns to seek union with those mother substances which are as yet unfertilized, and this increases the energy and of course there's a certain amount of birth of new water in the process. So you have a tremendous rejuvenation of the water body on the way to the point of delivery. The core of the vortex is identifiably cooler than the surrounding water masses by as much maybe as 0.2 of a degree centigrade. So in their summation of all these little cooling processes, then the water, when allowed to flow naturally, cools itself quite considerably. And so the vortex is a cooling process. Not only that, the water re-energizes itself, and it also divests itself of harmful parasites, pathogens, and so on. Because of the difference in the specific weight of oxygen and hydrogen in the water and other substances, the oxygen is thrown to the side of the pipe and directed to the pipe walls. Water moving in such a way can transport ores and other material similar to that down the middle, down the center of the water vortex without touching the sides, and actually can improve the quality of the ores, such as iron ore, in transit on the way to the point of use. Because as the oxygen is gradually consumed, some of it by the extermination of pathogenic bacteria, there is a reduction process occurring in the water flow itself. So the iron ore is already partially reduced, so to speak, before it arrives at the smelter. Our spinal column in German is expressed as a spiral column, and each of the vertebrae are called vortices. And so when you take this image in conjunction with the German view of the structure which upholds the human body, then here again in their concept it is also related to movement and vortical movement. Energy is primary and physical form is a secondary effect. In terms of the DNA molecule, that is the programming which creates the whole of the physical body. So in elaboration of this movement, energy creates the pathways through which it wants to move, or in which it wants to express itself. It's very important to begin to employ systems or to convert existing systems into ways of moving water which follows the law governing the flow of water, takes temperature into consideration, takes the alternating, pulsating movement of water into consideration, because this is a substance which is a living substance, and it cannot impart life unless it is itself alive. There's this constantly changing aspect of natural form, which is reflected in the seashells, reflected in the dynamics of the universe. It's this wall shape. Nature is not workings, there's not wheels in wheels, but they're whorls in whorls. There's one spiral moving inside another spiral as energy, because energy, it must be remembered, is always primary, and physical form is the secondary effect. We have to turn this around in our heads and remember that energy is primary, that nothing can appear in the physical until it has been first conceived of energetically, and the formation of anything physical is the concentration of the image until the physical form is realized. And this is one of the things that Viktor Schauberger stated on many occasions, that energy is primary and physical form is the secondary effect. This concentration of higher energies, immaterial energies, gradually coalesce into more energies of a lower frequency, finally having the physical effect in the physical form. Analogously, we might say that the energies coming from the sun, the X-ray energies and the high-frequency energies of the sun, impinge on the Earth's atmosphere, and they cause thermal variations, they cause the movement of winds, which is a lower form of energy than the energy coming from the sun. And these winds blow around the planet, and on the surface of the planet are the oceans, and the winds impinge on the water, which is a more dense medium than the air, and waves are created. And finally, on the shore, these waves create ripples on the sand, which is the very densest of the medium. And so you can see how the higher energies of the sun are actually responsible for the ripples on the ocean floor. So the ultimate effect, if we're talking purely energetically, so to speak, is that we've had three levels of energy demodulation, so to speak, from the sun to the air to the water, and finally the physical form, the ripples on the sand, have been created. The whole process of nature's evolution, or her workings, are put back to front, because things are taken as a cause when in fact they are an effect. And they are an effect in a long series of causes and effects. And what we are seeing around the world today in terms of the treatment of water and the forests are the massive inundations in China, in Bangladesh, and other places in the world which are due to deforestation. What happens here is related again to this peculiar anomaly state of water. Viktor described a movement of temperature which from any higher temperature down towards 4 degrees as being what he called a positive temperature gradient. And a negative temperature gradient was a temperature which moved up in the opposite direction, from 4 degrees either down or upwards, anyway away from 4 degrees, which was the condition of temperaturelessness or indifference, as Viktor called it. Now, the temperature gradient plays an enormous role in the Earth's water balance, and it's something which is not really understood, and it's very important that it should be understood, because if it's not, we shall go on having the same series of drought, deluge, and these massive flooding and inundations which we're experiencing at the moment. Now, water has to be handled with great sensitivity. It is a substance which is alive. It has to be treated as something alive. Therefore, it should not be exposed to excess heat. It should not be exposed to excess pressure. All those things we know in our human body are destructive. And the same thing applies to water. As long as water is able to flow in vortices down a river, and to have a movement, a flowing sort of waltzing movement to left and right as it spirals around one bend in one way and one the other, then it's able to generate these cooling vortices. And this always, no matter what the external conditions, or at least to a certain extent, no matter what the external conditions, the water is able to cool itself towards its all-important state of temperaturelessness, which is 4 degrees Celsius. Unfortunately, with many of the practices, hydraulic practices, river engineering practices and so on, water is forced and confined to flow in straight channels, and these channels are really like a straitjacket on water. It stops its free movement. It's not able to move. It's not able to waltz from left to right. All its ability to generate these vortices is removed from it. And as a living substance, it becomes diseased. And when forced to move in such or be conducted in such a way, then because it can't cool itself, it warms up. And the oxygen content becomes aggressive and fosters the development of parasitic life forms, bacteria and so on, because the water has become too warm. And its energy, like we have in our body, we have energies which enhance our immune system. When those become depleted, then we get sick. And the same thing happens to water. And the greatest and most sensitive care must be taken of water if it is to fulfill its functions, which is to support life. Because life without water is unthinkable. And one of the greatest fallacies in economic theory today is, or not fallacies, but sort of mistaken thinking, is that the world can continue to move, to grow in its materialistic way on the assumption that there can be no limit to quantitative growth. Of course there must be, because this planet is finite, and there's a finite number of artifacts or finite materials, raw materials. When rain falls onto the earth, the rain has a certain temperature. The earth, in order to absorb the rain, must have a cooler temperature. This is a positive temperature gradient because we are going from a hotter to a cooler temperature through the ground. As long as the ground is cooler than the incident rain, the water will infiltrate, and that really happens under conditions of healthy forest or healthy vegetation, which cools the ground. That means the water is absorbed, and in forestry conditions, 85% of the water that falls will be absorbed by the ground and won't be released, for instance, till 2 or 3 days after, even if it's heavy rain. Now, if we have removed the trees, if the ground has been warmed up, then we have the existence of a negative temperature gradient from the atmosphere into the ground, in that the rain is cooler but the receiving ground is warmer, and as a result the water will not penetrate but run sideways, like you put a drop of water on an electric hot plate. It skitters sideways and steams, and this steaming is the same thing that happens to the water which has fallen on the ground under a negative temperature gradient, in that because it is not absorbed, much larger areas of water are exposed to the sun, and there's a much faster and abnormal rate of evaporation, which means that a very large amount of water is returned to the atmosphere far too quickly. And as a result of that, you have large agglomerations of water here, no water there, deluges here, drought there. And that is all because the water balance has been disrupted, by and large, by humankind's activities in forestry and agriculture and water resources management. And we are paying the price for that now, and there is only one solution, and that is to reforest as fast as possible, because then the water will be allowed to enter into the aquifer systems underground. A lot of carbon dioxide will be absorbed in the photosynthetic process. The climate will be cooled and the water balance regulated, and then we can expect to have after that more even and regular climatic patterns than we are experiencing today. And all this is due to the lack of understanding of temperature in relation to water movement and water behavior. There are certain relations between water quality and the human immunity, in the same way there are relations between temperature and the immune qualities of water. Both blood and water fulfill the same function. They supply, on the one hand, the body earth with nutrients and elements so that it can grow and develop, and on the other hand, in our own body, it does the same thing. And these abilities are very much temperature dependent. But first we'll discuss water, because this also applies to the body. So anything really that I say about water also applies to blood, and it applies to sap and the movement of sap in trees. Water has its greatest density at its anomaly point of +4 degrees. It has to be maintained at this temperature for as long as possible, because this is a temperature which allows water to shift material. It allows water to grind up rocks, for instance, on its passage down a river, which then are supplied to the environment through which it passes. The coolness allows for the removal, transport of sediment, which is also which needs to happen in the blood, in the body, because the blood has to take waste matter and take it away. If the temperature relationships in the blood are not correct, then things like varicose veins and sclerosis and so on happen, because the blood isn't in a position energetically anymore to shift the material. The same applies to water. Now, water has, of course, its content of oxygen, and oxygen, as we all know, is always present at growth and also in decay. And whether it is active in one or the other spheres depends on the temperature. And in water, this crucial, what you might call changeover temperature, is at 9 degrees. Below that, the oxygen is, so to speak, bound by the water and is a passive. It's passive, and it goes towards the creating of high-grade microorganisms beneficial to life. Once water rises above that 9 degrees, then it gradually becomes more aggressive, and it enters an energetic level which is, so to speak, in harmony with parasites and bacteria, and then fosters their growth and development. And that is why it's very important in terms of the way we transport water and we move it from one place to another, that it should always be able to cool itself. It should be able to breathe, because as a living substance it must also be able to breathe. And in our modern world we seal it up in concrete or steel pipes, and gradually the water suffocates, and its oxygen content gets totally burnt up. Water has to be handled with great sensitivity. It is a substance which is alive. It has to be treated as something alive. Therefore, it should not be exposed to excess heat. It should not be exposed to excess pressure. All those things we know in our human body are destructive. And the same thing applies to water. There are two forces acting in any flow of water. That there is the force of gravity, which flows from the source down to the sea, and there's the force of levity, which flows from the sea back up to the source again. And the trout responds and is able to manipulate the forces of gravity and the forces of levity in order to maintain its station in flowing water. The extraordinary thing is that when a trout is startled from its lair or where it's reposing, then it accelerates upstream with extraordinary velocity, using the force of levity to move itself upstream. Viktor Schauberger found himself in a very high alpine virgin forest, which he frequented so often, and in which he found the most extraordinary events. He came across them. It was as though he was almost ordained to be there at the right time in order to perceive them. He came across this fast-flowing upland stream in which there was a trout, one of these stationary trout, just with a very slight flick of its tail, was standing in this rushing water. And apart from its station there, which of course made him ask the questions of how it was able to stand there and so on, he knew that about 1 kilometer downstream there was a waterfall, a very high waterfall, where the falling water atomized into mist. And so how was it possible, he asked himself, that this trout managed to get to this spot? Because they always come back to their spawning grounds to breed again. And from these sort of insights he evolved the idea of this interaction of two energies, of this gravitational movement from the source to the sea and from the sea back up to the source again. And the trout uses the levitational force in order to surmount these waterfalls. And it circles down at the bottom of the waterfall until it finds this upward vortex and then throws itself into the vortex, which then sucks it up and eventually ends up on the upstream end of it. Viktor Schauberger decided to test this out. Viktor had asked some of his foresters to boil up a cauldron of about 100 liters of water about 150 meters upstream. And on his signal they poured the water into the stream. And as soon as the water hit the stream 150 meters up from where the fish was, the fish started to flail its tail as hard as it could and went backwards. Something had been cut in the water. The energy, which was the levitational force, had been destroyed by heat. Levitational force is the bioenergetic force, the biomagnetic force. It is the life force. And Viktor observed these moss tips. The moss tips pointed up against the stream, against the current. But when the water was heated up through deforestation, then the moss tips pointed downstream, although because the water had heated, it was less dense than it was before. So he regarded these tips of the moss as being an indicator indicating the health or disease of a stream. There is also another process by which the trout enables itself to stay in the fast-flowing water, and that is through the difference between the speed of the water as it flows past the trout's body and trout's breathing itself. According to Viktor Schauberger, every particle of water is associated with a particular velocity and a particular temperature. And if the temperature relative to that velocity is exceeded, then turbulence automatically occurs. So in the terms of the trout, it's sitting with its body in the center, the coldest core water of the stream. And as the water filaments approach the body, they get squeezed aside by the body and in the process accelerate. And as they accelerate, they exceed their specific velocity relative to temperature, and turbulence occurs on the rear flank of the trout, so it actually propels the trout upstream. The trout breathes in, or at least it takes in water through its lungs, extracts the oxygen from the water, or a large part of it, which then that water passes out through the gills in a semi-oxygen deficient state. And as a result of its lack of oxygen, it absorbs oxygen from the surrounding water and expands. And this expansion is also pushed on the back of the trout, which squeezes it forward like a bar of soap. When it wants to accelerate, it flaps its gills very fast, and that creates more turbulence. And also, because there is a greater expulsion of oxygen deficient water, that means there's a greater expansion of water behind it, which pushes the trout forward upstream. When we approach a new way of designing or a new way of looking at moving water, for instance, then we have to design a process which allows water to change and to transform and to move and to be itself, fundamentally to be itself. And there was a time when Viktor, fairly early in his days, built a log flume for the transport of logs down the mountain. When it came to build it, it was going to be constructed out of timber, and it was going to be a half-egg shape in the profile, so that there's this shape made out of wooden slats. And when the workers asked him, well, where they were going to build it, he said, well, now you see the valley here and see the river. He said, that's the way that the energies like to move in this situation, so we copy that. And one of his great adages was, comprehend and copy nature. Because nature knows best how to do things, and has known best for years. It's only human beings who decide arbitrarily to impose their own laws, or what they think are laws, which are actually only half laws. In the case of gravity, for instance, with the total negation of levity, there's the law of gravity, but there is the law of levity. In fact, there's the law of both together. So in this log flume, which was built to follow the contours of the valley, there were slats attached to the sides of the walls on left-hand bends and on right-hand bends, so that the water was caused to rotate or to form longitudinal forces anti-clockwise and then clockwise as it went around these bends. In this first instance, built in Steyerling, this was constructed for Prince Adolf zu Schaumburg-Lippe, who was the owner of great forest estates, and the actual length of the flume was about 2 kilometers. The water and temperature was very strictly controlled. Viktor determined that in order to make the flume function properly, in order to generate the right energies, it was necessary to introduce different temperatures of water into the flume. From the surface of the water to the bottom of the holding basin, there's a thermal stratification, that the water stratifies itself according to temperature and density, so that the coldest water, the 4-degree water, is at the bottom of the basin, and gradually the water heats as it goes towards the top. And so there would have been a pipe which took bottom water out, the 4-degree water out, then another one maybe at 6 degrees, and another one taking the 9-degree water out, and these would have been introduced into the flume tangentially, so that they automatically inaugurated a spiral movement, a vortical movement, a longitudinal vortical movement, in which the coldest water would have been at the center, surrounded by the water with less density and greater temperature. The colder the water is, the more laminar its flow. That means that it's more straight line movement, although it was still screwing, it's still spiraling. And the logs, the heavy beach logs, which were otherwise called sinkers because they sunk to the bottom, were suspended in this central vortical flow, this cold water, because they were denser than the densest water, and the only place that they could be was in the center of the dense water. And they were conducted all the way down these flumes without touching the sides. And his flumes were so successful that actually about 9 of them were built. It was this phenomenon that enabled Viktor to transport logs, which were heavier than water, down his log flume without touching the sides. Now these logs were known as sinkers because normally they were heavier than water and they dropped to the bottom. But because of this centripetal, this involutionary, this inward moving from the outside towards the inside spiral movement, the densest part of the water mass was in the very center of the flow, and the logs, being denser, had to occupy the densest position, surrounded by the immediately denser water, the 4-degree water. And so in moving down the log flume, there was a suction created in front of the log because the coldest water was accelerating, which actually sucked the log along in its wake. Periodically, because of course eventually these different water temperatures mixed and tend to become a uniform temperature, Viktor used to allow some water to drain out and at the same point introduce what he called energy water, which was very cold water from an adjacent spring or stream which had a temperature of about 4.5 degrees centigrade, in order to reintroduce this central charge, central mass of very cold water which would continue to accelerate. And this is really how the log flume worked. There were other factors involved which relate to the way the water was caused to rotate in anti-clockwise vortices on left-hand bends and clockwise vortices on right-hand bends. In order to do this, Viktor had his workmen nail slats at an angle around the outside of the bend, the outside surface of the bend. And the water encountering these slats was imparted either a clockwise spiral or an anti-clockwise spiral, so that the effect of this was when it emerged at the surface, the log was always pushed away from the bend, so that the logs passing down this flume never touched the sides. The flume was therefore never damaged in its use, and nor were the logs, and they arrived in absolutely impeccable condition. And on the first day that it was used, one of the criteria which determined whether Viktor was to be paid or not is whether the flume would deliver 1,000 solid cubic meters of timber in one day. In the first day of operation, it delivered 1,600 cubic meters of timber, and Viktor Schauberger was paid. And everybody else, all the experts, were furious at the success of this, because it showed that somewhere in their hydraulic theory there was a great error, a great misunderstanding of water. And Viktor used to say in this regard, how can you possibly understand how water, a living substance, can behave when the only place you test it in is in laboratories instead of out in nature, where then water acts in relation to nature's laws and not the laws that you have contrived in your places of research. Viktor constructed a reservoir of water at the top, at the head of the flume. And when the time came for opening, on the opening day, the experts arrived and saw the construction of this basin, holding basin, and said that it was far too flimsy. It certainly couldn't withstand the pressure of the water and so on. And Viktor gave them no answer and went down and stood right in the middle of the wall opposite where the water was going to flow in. And then he gave the signal by firing 2 shots of his carbine to signal to allow the water to rush in, which it did with tremendous force and volume. And Viktor said to the people who were gesticulating, saying, "Come back, you're going to be killed." He said, "What does it matter? If I'm a fool, then I'm going to be swept away, and so will my theories at the same time. But I believe in what I'm doing." And so he stood looking over the wall, watching this water flow in. And the water actually flowed in around the sides of this egg-shaped basin. And when they converged at the far end, then they produced a counter wave which moved back in the direction of the inflowing water, which was in this instance about 4 meters high, full of mud and rocks and things, and therefore exerted a counter pressure against the incoming water, and the egg-shaped holding basin held. And the experts were absolutely dumbfounded. Why should it have done this? And they then asked him, where did you get the idea for this basin? And Viktor said, well, a common chicken told me how to do it. And finally, when they calculated the strength of the walls statically, they were found to be 12 times stronger than they need have been in order to resist the inflow of water and to be able to support the basin, the sides of the basin, when it was full. So this log flume is an example of how we might construct systems for moving water where there is a continual alternation of movement, of swaying movement, with different vortical flows, so that the water is able to regenerate itself and to cool itself. Preferably these should be enclosed, so that there is also no access to the water from the sun and from extra too much heat. They timed a block of wood flowing from the holding basin down to the mill in the early morning, when the water temperatures were about 8 or 9 degrees, and it took 29 minutes to cover the distance. Later in the afternoon, they got the same block of wood over the same distance, and the water temperature had by this time risen to about 14 or 15 degrees, and the block of wood took 40 minutes to cover the distance. So that it shows that with increasing heat, water flows more slowly. So this process was employed in his log flumes, and it is a basis by which we could redesign any new water conduits which have to be constructed in this country. There are other systems which probably could be used to improve what is there already, and that is the building in or incorporation of veins in, so we say, an open channel, which would cause the water to rotate as soon as it hit them, that it would make the water rotate or make a double spiral movement down the center of the channel, which would again allow water at least to breathe and reoxygenate itself and to cool itself to a certain extent. But the flowing in straight trapezoid channels, which is the general system of moving water according to modern hydraulic theory, physically kills water until what arrives at the other end, the point of use, is virtually a water corpse, apart from the fact that it's also been chlorinated, and the chlorine, while it does remove bacteria and other sort of unwelcome organisms, will also finally sterilize the blood from people who drink it all the time. And research has shown that 18% of bladder cancers and 9% of intestinal cancers have been caused by, rectal cancers have been caused by the consumption of chlorinated water. So when we drink chlorinated water, we actually harm our immune system, and we drag it down to a level where it's more likely to fall, the body is more likely to fall victim to disease. So it's very important to begin to employ systems or to convert existing systems into ways of moving water which follows the law of governing the flow of water, takes temperature into consideration, takes the alternating, pulsating movement of water into consideration, because this is a substance which is a living substance, and it cannot impart life unless it is itself alive. So as something alive, we have to make sure that whatever system and whatever materials we choose to reticulate it allows water to breathe. In 1938 in Nuremberg, Viktor Schauberger re-examined Lord Kelvin's water drop experiment to determine the static charge in falling water. Viktor wanted to demonstrate that water does, in its falling, generate charges. This is a device. The arrangement of it was first designed by Lord Kelvin about 1880-85, and he called it his influence machine because it demonstrated the influences of fields, in this instance static fields and positive and negative fields. Water is supplied through this vertical pipe here, splits, and then comes down, pointing downwards, and ends up with a very, very fine, the finest hypodermic needle at the end, so that the water jet coming out of this is as fine a jet as you can get. Inside this cylinder is a cylinder of brass in order to collect the charge which is falling from here. This cylinder is coated on the outside with paraffin wax to isolate it so that the charge doesn't leak outwards from it. This is the same cylinder, and this diagonal here is a copper rod which is attached to the brass here and also attached to a strip of brass in the bottom of this receiving vessel. So the charge here is the same as the charge here. And when the water falls through, it generates either a positive or negative charge here, and the charge is reversed by the time it hits the bottom. And so a charge builds up here, let's say positive, and here negative. And according to Kelvin, the build-up of the charge is unlimited. And over each of these, or between all this arrangement, you get a negative static field builds up on this side and a positive static field builds up on this side, which can theoretically go to infinity. From each of these cylinders there's a black cable, which is a high tension cable, and these can be used to bring the charged field to where you want to use it. For instance, on the neon tube, and on the electroscope. To demonstrate the charge in falling water, the charge is transferred to the inside of this, causing the foils of the electroscope to flap. There's a charge which is transferred inside without even me touching it. And if I touch it, then it's quite strong, and it'll go on flapping like this. And as Viktor Schauberger said, very good quality water would cause this to flap 150 times before it ceased doing so. The lower the quality of the water, the fewer times it would flap. A water molecule is a dipole molecule. That means it has a positive and negative charge at each end of the molecule. And when it falls, it generates a charge because it spins. And so it generates both an electric field and a magnetic field. And this is why, with a full distance of maybe 2 kilometers or a kilometer, when rain falls onto the ground, it comes with an enormous charge in it. And this charge is imparted directly into the plant when the rain hits the plant's leaves, which is why rainfall is much more productive than irrigation water. These very small, thin jets of water falling out of these hypodermic needles generates a charge. It's really a small thunderstorm, this machine, because it demonstrates that in these clouds, charges are generated by falling water, which eventually ends up in the discharge of lightning. So in the thunderstorm, very powerful positive and very powerful negative fields develop, and they short circuit through a lightning strike. The water falling through here develops a charge, and as like charges repel each other, then at the bottom this jet starts to spread out sideways, and the water will actually start coming up again and then going down again. So in this movement, you can begin to see why there are such strong up and down drafts in thunderstorms. And this, of course, is a very, very small scale, and I have, using this device, generated a spark which will jump across a distance of 2 centimeters. Every millimeter jumped represents 2,000 volts. So the 2 centimeters that I achieved with this device represents 40,000 volt discharge. I can only say if you happen to hang on to it yourself, you really jump. There seemed to be a correlation between altitude and the length of the spark gap. There also may be other variables such as air humidity and air temperature as well. The idea is to create an implosive turbine where the water is moved from the outside inwards instead of the inside outwards, which is what's happening with all conventional propellers. Think in 3 dimensions in a very complex geometrical system which can't be described by the straight line, circle and point.